Shall I start? When I was asked to do this, I thought it was a little daunting to put 75 years into a few minutes. I started to think about what I've learned from church and what the key things are from church. And the theme of connection is what came to me. And as I thought about connections, I thought in terms of my life that there have been a number of random events that have happened that have connected to form a shape, to shape my life. So the theme that I decided upon for this little discussion is the blessing of a life shaped by random events. My childhood, I was born, as we've noted, in 1944 in New York City to a non-observant Jewish family just following World War II. I have one older brother who's lived his adult life in Portland, Oregon. My father was a lawyer, and my mother was a buyer for Saks Fifth Avenue. She was my very early role model of a professional woman before that became the norm. We moved to New Rochelle, which is, if you don't know, a suburb of New York City, and most recently the epicenter of the COVID infection in New York. But we moved there when I was still a baby, and that's where I spent my childhood. My mother was largely absent due to her career. She traveled to all the Saks Fifth Avenue stores. At that time, there were 26. She traveled to them twice a year, and she went on buying trips to Europe at least once a year. So I was cared for by a live-in governess. My mother would make beautiful appearances. She was always beautifully dressed and coiffed and lovely, but she didn't really have the role of a mother as we think about it. That made me different from my friends, which is always awkward for a child, but it was generally a very happy childhood. I was very close to my father. He loved music and literature. He considered Macbeth and King Lear appropriate bedtime stories. And our home was always filled with classical music, which gave me a deep love of both literature and music. Of all the things I love about Rochester, the RPO tops the list. I know many church members agree, and we so look forward to being able to return to Kodak Hall someday, hopefully soon. Excuse me. My father loved golf, and I frequently accompanied him to the driving range. When I was 6, I noticed a stable next door where they offered pony rides. I asked him if I could ride one, and he said I could. I believe he regretted that answer for the rest of his life, as I was never far from a horse from that time on. I lived at the stables every weekend through my growing years. They called us barn brats. And I even was lucky enough to spend a teenage summer on a Colorado ranch, just like they did on the Mickey Mouse Club, which was my favorite show. I was very lucky to grow up near New York City. Access to Broadway shows, ballet, museums, most importantly, the National Horse Show, rodeos, the circus. We were so fortunate to have the means to take advantage of so much that was nearby. I enjoyed great privilege throughout my childhood and really through all my life. I have always been grateful and never taken that for granted. As far as my education, I was an average student. I was more interested in boys and social life than I was in school. My high school boyfriend, who was a year ahead of me, wanted to go to Princeton, but he didn't get in and went to his second choice, which was the U of R. That was random event number 1. I went to Syracuse University to be near him in Rochester. And when I arrived in Syracuse the first day, I was off doing first day freshman activities And my father and a friend from high school, who was a junior at Syracuse and whose name was Bill, had unpacked and put away all of my things. Since I couldn't find anything for several weeks, I constantly phoned Bill, and his roommate, who was named Jim, usually answered, clearly annoyed by the interruptions, and told Bill, "It's that damn girl again." This is random event number 2. Turned out Mr. Annoyed Jim lived in Rochester and traveled home most weekends. So I frequently grabbed a ride with him to see my boyfriend. Over time, it turned out I liked Jim better than the boyfriend, and I married him at the end of my junior year when I was 20 years old. We remained in Syracuse while I graduated, taught middle school English for a couple of years, and Jim completed law school. And then we moved to Rochester, where he entered a family law practice. Shortly after moving here, we had the first of our 2 daughters, Kim, who is now 53 and a teacher in Los Angeles with a wonderful husband and 2 sons, and Debbie, who is now 51, a lawyer who joined the family practice with her dad here in Rochester. She also has a wonderful husband, a daughter who is leaving for college in August, which I still can't believe, and a son who's a junior at Sutherland High School. You may have seen Debbie on billboards or TV advertising. Her name is Deborah Field. She's a personal injury attorney. That's just a little plug. Being a mother and a grandmother have always been such a gift to me. And having one of my children here in town and being a part of the grandchildren's lives has brought me great joy. While my daughters were small, I returned to school and took a master's degree part-time in English literature at the University of Rochester. No doubt sparked by memories of Macbeth and King Lear at bedtime. And here is random event number 3. Debbie was born at a very low birth weight, and I was feeding her and watching TV one day when I saw an ad for the March of Dimes. They were looking for volunteers. I volunteered to work at the Birth Defect Center at Strong and became friends with the head of the program, who was a great guy named Ruth Myers. He and his wife and 2 daughters moved to Alabama a few years later, where he took a similar position at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. But we kept in touch from time to time by mail. Jim and I divorced after 10 years of marriage in 1975. We had married so young, and as we matured, we really didn't seem to be a good fit. It was a very difficult decision since we had 2 children, but I was very unhappy and hoped that bringing them up in 2 happy households would be better than 1 unhappy household. Time has proven me right on that point. I remained in Rochester so that our children could grow up with both of their parents. We shared custody, and after the first couple of painful years, became supportive friends and co-parents, which we remain to this day. Our children and grandchildren have benefited from that relationship, moving easily between our homes for holiday celebrations, etc. He remarried 3 or 4 years after our divorce and had a second family. Sadly, he was widowed after 22 years of marriage and later remarried again, adding an even larger band to our crew. I think the world of his wives as he does of my second husband. My own remarriage occurred 13 years after the divorce and directly relates to yet a 4th random event, which I'll tell you about shortly. Before that, I'll tell you about my careers. Surprisingly, since my mother had such a vibrant career, I never really gave much thought to what I might do after college for a career. But I was a good writer and found my first job in Rochester in 1974 as a reporter and editor for Wolf Publications, which was a group of suburban weeklies. Excuse me. I also was writing for the Democrat and Chronicle's Upstate magazine. The contacts I made led me to a job in 1978 as PR director for St. Mary's Hospital, which I learned a lot there. One of the biggest things I learned was when I was put in charge of a dinner celebrating the 125th anniversary of St. Mary's Hospital. One of the doctors suggested that we invite Senator Patrick Moynihan to be the speaker for the event. I thought having a senator would be quite a fabulous thing, and so I called his office, and much to my surprise, they were absolutely delighted to have him come speak at St. Mary's. I only after that learned that he was a very pro-choice senator and had never been allowed anywhere near St. Mary's Hospital. People started calling up, they were going to boycott the dinner. The Right to Life people were boycotting St. Mary's Hospital, and I was in the middle of it. So I called Bishop Clark, who is a true gentleman, and I met with him, and I said, you've got to get me, fix this somehow. So he promised that he would take care of it if I would promise not to have him in any pictures with Senator Moynihan. So I had to set up the dinner so that Senator Moynihan, who was a little drunk actually when he got there, was at one end of the dais and the bishop was at the complete other end of the dais. And I warned the photographers that if they ever took a picture of the two of them, they would never be photographers for us again. So he really saved me on that. Another thing I learned there was about working with the media. We were doing a big renovation, and the media had received word that there was asbestos involved, and they were on top of it. And so I talked to the builders, and they assured me that they were monitoring the asbestos very carefully. There was no problem. So I invited the media in and showed them the monitoring devices, took them through the renovation. And I thought we were done, and I was very proud of myself. And one of the reporters noticed that some of the workers were wearing face masks. And so she asked me why they were wearing face masks. And I said, well, I don't know. Why don't you go ask them? Well, that was mistake number two. She went to the reporter and said, why are you wearing a face mask? And he said, are you kidding? This place is filled with asbestos. So that taught me a lot about media relations, which I never did again. Despite all of these, I ended up having a 25-year career in healthcare public relations. Following St. Mary's, I managed healthcare and other accounts for Hutchins Y&R, which was the local division of an international ad agency. And then I moved to the top of the healthcare ladder in Rochester as Director of Public Relations and Communications for the U of R Medical Center, which in those days was composed of Strong Hospital, the School of Nursing, and the medical school. Our team was responsible for all the media relations and all the publications for those three entities. Today, the medical center, of course, is much bigger, but in those days, that's what it was. I know one of the people on this call is Nancy Bolger, who was absolutely key to the success of that department. She's probably the best writer in Rochester. Hi, Nancy. During those years, I did different volunteer activities. The most significant to me was serving as a support group leader at Alternatives for Battered Women, which is now called Willow. That experience introduced me to work that was much closer to my heart than my PR career. As a single parent with a solid income and children heading for college, I couldn't walk away from my career until later. But when I could, I left the U of R, started a PR consulting firm with a close friend, and thereby had the flexibility to return to Syracuse University part-time to take a master's in social work. I did that over 4 years from the ages of 50 to 54 and started a new career as a psychotherapist. There were times during my education as a social worker that my social work education bumped up against my public relations consulting career. There was one event that I'll just share with you where in the morning I was working at the Community Health Network, which is an AIDS and HIV treatment program, doctor's program. And in the afternoon, I was working in my consulting firm. So one day, my partner Daisy and I were meeting with a corporate client for our consulting firm. And I was meeting her after my morning at the HIV center, where a lot of my responsibility was in safe sex education. I had a cold and I was about to sneeze during this meeting, and we were in a big boardroom with the big mahogany table, the whole thing. And I reached in my pocket for a tissue, and a bright red condom came flying out and across the boardroom table. Obviously, there was a dead silence in the room, and my partner simply said, "You know, you can't take her anywhere." And everyone laughed, and we went on with the meeting. But there were often situations where public relations and social work kind of bumped up against each other. After I finished my master's in social work, I returned to Strong as a therapist in psychiatry for the next 10 years. I also had a part-time private practice as a psychotherapist for 14 years. I truly love this work. It's really a great honor to be trusted to walk with someone during the difficult times of their lives. And I was always honored to be able to do that. I retired from Strong at age 66 and from private practice at age 70. And then there's my retirement career. There's a couple of people on this call that are familiar with that one, Jane and Craig. Years before I retired, I saw an article in the paper about the Equa Center, which is a horseback riding program that helped children and adults with disabilities, military veterans with post-traumatic stress, and at-risk youth to live their fullest lives. I knew when I retired, that would be the place for me to be able to work with horses and continue to help people, in an ideal combination for me. From that first pony ride at age 6 until today, there's just something about those horses that fill my heart and my spirit. And watching them change so many lives is really a miracle. I have now been volunteering at the Equa Center for 10 years and get the greatest joy from being there. I think it's my favorite career. And then to my true life partner. You may recall random event number 3, Debbie's birth weight, which led me to meeting Gary Myers at the Birth Defect Center. Well, here is random event number 4. When I first took the position of PR director at the medical center, my staff was working on Strong's first physician referral directory. When I asked them to show me what they were modeling their effort after, they brought to me the directory from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, which is where my friend Gary Myers had gone when he left Rochester 12 years earlier. I wondered if he was still there, so I looked him up in the directory, and lo and behold, he was. I called him up to say hi, and thus began the most wonderful years of my life. He was no longer married, was still affiliated with a research project through the U of R, and within weeks we went on our first date, although we had known each other for more than 20 years. We fell immediately and deeply in love with one another, married exactly a year from our first date, and celebrated our 30th anniversary last March. Gary had 2 grown daughters and later 3 granddaughters. Our courtship was unusual and wonderful. When we first got together, he was leaving for a research year in the Seychelles Islands, which is, if you don't know, off the east coast of Africa at about the level of Kenya in the Indian Ocean. So we spent our first year writing letters every day. There was no internet, and there was only one fax machine in all of Seychelles, and having very expensive phone calls every week. We also met one another about every 8 weeks or so, someplace wonderful in the world. We married in Seychelles 6 months into his year there. And then 6 months later, he returned to live with me in Rochester and to work at the medical center. We had never spent more than 3 weeks together before marrying, but we both knew it was right. I was 44, he was 53. Neither of us had expected to ever remarry, but life surprised us in the most wonderful way. He became yet another cherished family member for my children. His daughters lived in the South, and we didn't see as much of them. As all our children were grown, we shared our empty nest by rescuing retired racing greyhounds for many years. Although they have all gone to the Rainbow Bridge now, each was special and remains close to our hearts. The one true heartache of our lives has been that his older daughter died of cancer in 2007, and his younger daughter died of cancer last November. He is recovering from this latest loss, but it has been a very hard time for us, as you can imagine. We hold tightly to one another and grateful for the soulmates that we are. Now I'll talk to you about religion. Having been born into a non-observant Jewish family, I had no Jewish education and rarely went to synagogue. As a result, I never felt a spiritual connection with Judaism. While my first husband was Jewish and attended services on high holy days, I went along because it was expected, but nothing more. As I got older and began experiencing the losses that age brings, the illness and death of parents, friends, and loved ones, I really wanted to find a faith community. I had been to a wedding at Spiritus Christi many years ago, conducted by Father Jim, and felt really comfortable there. As a Jewish woman, I was looking for a Spiritus Christi without the Christi. And here is random event number 5. An article in the newspaper about First Unitarians with a photo of the Susan B. Anthony Lounge where the religious banners used to hang. One had a Star of David, and I thought maybe I could fit in there. I found from the first day I walked in the door that I really did fit in there. The friendships, the activities have always been very fulfilling for me. That was 10 years ago, and I'm forever grateful for that random event of that picture in the newspaper. I also wish the banners were still there, but that's a story for another day. My activities at church have included being a Soul Matters co-facilitator for 9 years, a member of the pastoral care team, and I participated in 1 year of Wellspring. I've been a frequent greeter and usher. I served on the search team that brought Reverends David, Emily, and Marcus to our church, and then served on Emily and Marcus's support team. I was a member of the CCC that helped support many in our church, including myself, during the dark times of a few years ago. Church also led me to Reverend Joy Collins, with whom I've been meeting monthly for the past 2 years for spiritual counseling. Her insight, grace, and wisdom are a true gift to me. So, to my theory of random events and connections, if my high school boyfriend had gotten into Princeton, if my friend Bill had a roommate who didn't live in Rochester, if Debbie had been born a normal birth weight, if my staff had been modeling their physician directory after any other university in the country, or if I hadn't read the Democrat and Chronicle the day it highlighted First Unitarian, well, I might have had a good life, but I wouldn't have had this wonderful and blessed life that I'm lucky enough to share with you today. Luck, grace, divine plan, I'll never know, I'm just filled with wonder and gratitude for it all. And that's my story.
It's your story.